and welcome to the Cons History of Jenever event. My name is Erwin Ostindi. For this next segment, so thrilled to have two members of Cons present, and Richard Unger is a co-founder of Cons Vancouver, and so that shows the history both of the Cons Vancouver group, bringing forward someone from our early days and showing the connection from our past as an organization in Vancouver, looking at these questions of Dutch culture. And today's session with Jacqueline, who's also a board member, current board member of Cons Vancouver, talking about the history of Jenever, but also the cultural uses of Jenever.
Thank you, Erwin. Hello, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Van Dijk, the Chief Librarian of the North Vancouver District Public Library, and I'm here today in Story Lab, the recording studio at the Lynn Valley Library. So this is a space where stories are created, and we are absolutely thrilled to have our special guest here today. So joining me by Zoom is Richard Unger in his home in Vancouver. Richard is Professor Emeritus in the History Department of UBC, where he taught European history for 4 decades. He's written extensively on the history of medieval and early modern trade and industry in the Low Countries, and has written 2 books on the history of beer brewing. It's not easy to say. So we're here today to talk about the history of Jenever. And Richard's knowledge of Jenever, he tells me, is a byproduct of his research on the Dutch brewing industry in the 17th and 18th centuries. So he's got that along with his personal experience of Jenever. So thank you for taking the time with us today, Richard.
Oh, not at all. My pleasure.
So let's start at the beginning. What can you tell us about the origins of Jenever?
Well, it's distilled spirits, and distillation actually comes from China originally, and reached Europe through Arab intermediaries in the Middle Ages. So in the 12th and 13th centuries, doctors start to recommend trying a little distilled spirit of some sort to help with health problems. And then in the 16th century, Dutch traders went off to France to get wine. But the problem was wine took up a lot of space, and some of it wasn't very good and it could go bad. So they began to distill it and create brandewijn, brandy, and import that. Much smaller volume, much higher, and with more alcohol in it per unit, per liter. Then the question was, well, if you can do that with wine, why not do it with something else? And by the end of the 16th century, there were experiments with, by the middle of the 16th century, in fact, experiments with making, distilling what's called moutwijn, a malt which has been allowed to ferment, called barley wine, I guess, in England. But with high alcohol content. So the method was very similar to what you started with to make beer. So the transfer to distilling the product rather than just sending it off for people to drink the transition was pretty simple. The addition of juniper berry flavoring also comes from the late 16th century. And it was slow. Jenever sales were slow to take off in the first half of the 17th century. But by the 1650s, 1660s, the increase was considerable, going up about 2 to 3% a year on average, and boomed, in fact, oddly enough, in 1671 and 72, when the country was being invaded by French troops. And that's because the government started to tax imports of French brandy and wine, so drinkers had nowhere to go but off to Jenever. And then production just grew and grew and grew through the 18th century, and by the end of the century, by the middle of the century, the Dutch manufacturing was a considerable contribution to the total of Dutch manufacturing and distilling Jenever. And the industry thrived also in the 18th, through the 18th into the 19th century, continued to grow, and hasn't hasn't flagged yet. It's still going strong.
Wow. So it really started out as something medicinal, and then quickly grew to be seen as a highly desired medicine, shall we say, and grew by leaps and bounds. And so, how did larger scale distilling come about from all of that?
Well, yeah. In the beginning, it was very small scale. In fact, a number of breweries, and they were all small scale too, just shifted over to making, with a little addition of equipment, moved over to distilling as tastes changed. But it was really, that's why there were, I don't know, something like more than 100 distilleries in Schiedam, for example, by the middle of the 18th century. But the number began to go down after around 1850. One of the reasons was the introduction of steam power. Steam engines made, and having supplies of coal that could be used to heat, to carry out the distilling process. That was one reason, so they could increase scale. Another reason was ease of transportation. Railroads meant you could sell Jenever over a larger area inland, so they could increase in size. And also science. The understanding the distilling process and what alcohols were, and the ability then to measure and control a production meant that it took larger scale, took more capital, and then big distilleries began to appear by the middle of the 19th century. It wasn't until around 1700 that thermometers were introduced into breweries and distilleries. And it wasn't really until the, I would say about 1800 that they began to use hydrometers to measure the alcohol content. Before that, it was all just, whatever the distiller thought was sort of more or less right.
And I guess they were doing a fair bit of tasting as they were determining what tasted right.
The only way to be sure it was good.
Oh, wow. And so what can you tell us about the connection to the spice trade in the East Indies and specific ingredients? Because juniper, I would think, would be local to the Europe, but what about beyond that?
Well, a lot of juniper is one standard component of flavoring. But after that, you can put in anything you want. Doesn't matter. And distillers tried, and still try, by the way, different combinations of herbs and spices. And so spice trade did pick up considerably after around 1600. The East India Company figured out how to get back and forth from Indonesia quickly and year-round, which their predecessors couldn't do. And so they brought in, there was a sizable trade in spices through Amsterdam. Amsterdam became the center of the spice trade in the 17th century. So there were lots of things available. Mind you, they didn't have to have these different spices, but distillers could use it as they do now to make their drink distinctive. But the quantities involved compared to the volume of drink, very, very small indeed. And many of them are local. Things that you could grow in your back garden. On the other hand, pepper, cinnamon, mace came from the Far East.
Aniseed, yeah.
Aniseed, yeah. So they could be and were imported. You could add coffee beans if you wanted. Again, in small quantity. Chocolate, cocoa, sure. You could try it. Who knows? If consumers liked it, distillers would continue to produce it. But again, these are only small changes in taste. It's a small change in taste.
It sounds like a lot of fun too. Speaking of international trade, I understand there's a connection with Canada. Can you tell us about that?
Oh yeah. The industry especially thrived. This is in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially thrived in port towns. Not so much because sailors like to drink Jenever, which they did, but because then they could export it. In the 18th century, only about 15% of Jenever was drunk in the Dutch Republic. So 85% was exported. In the middle of the 18th century, the Republic was exporting 3 or 4 million liters of Jenever annually.
Wow.
With big markets in Spain and France, because the stuff did very well in the tropics. Whereas beer would spoil. Jenever was okay in the heat. And so in Indonesia, for example, or in the West Indies, Jenever was a logical export good. So that's why, again, Schiedam was such a center of the distilling industry in the 18th century. But, of course, with all those export markets, another one was Canada. Dutch traders went to Quebec to collect wood. And, of course, they had to take something along to trade for the wood. And so among the goods was Jenever. And it became a popular drink in Quebec as a result. And I can't swear about the 21st century, but I know in the 20th century, Gros Gin, as it was called, was a very popular drink in Quebec.
What's the name again? Sorry?
Gros Gin, big gin.
Oh, okay. Gros Gin. Yeah.
And something I didn't know, but maybe Quebecers can help me out. There's a cocktail which was popular for a while in Quebec called a caribou, which is something like 90% red wine and 10% Jenever.
That sounds fun too.
Yeah.
So switching back to the Netherlands, though, and looking back through history and a few centuries, is Jenever something that was only ever consumed by the upper classes, or was it available for across all social classes, except maybe some of them just drank it out of prettier glasses?
It was people who were well off, even before there was Jenever. Drank wine, they preferred wine, and brandy when brandy became available in the 16th century. So that they were less likely, let's say they didn't, but were less likely to drink Jenever. Poor people couldn't afford anything. And traditional drinkers and drinkers with a little more money, and students could get beer at no tax-free, so they stuck to beer.
Wow. That's interesting social policy.
Yeah. Well, and I guess another reason was that another thing that happened was skilled laborers, carpenters, for example, bricklayers. They would also tend to be beer drinkers. They're traditional beer drinkers. I think it's still true. So that left laborers, poor people who could scrape together some money. They became the gin drinkers. And older folks, who again would not have much money, it became a drink for the poorer, if not the poor. But as I say, it also was popular outside of the Netherlands, and in the West Indies, for example, or in the tropics, it would have been a common drink for everybody. And in Quebec too, apparently.
That's interesting. And so are you aware of any, switching gears again, are you aware of any varying customs or recipes for Jenever, or is there any other social context that you're aware of that you'd like to share?
Let me think. Well, I mean, of course, people like to drink and conviviality. Getting together with friends, I think, is the phrase. It is true of alcohol consumption in general, and it certainly was true about Jenever. And of course, there were pubs, places to go drink, and there were, well, places to go get cafes, places to get beer were quite common. There was one for about every 200 people in Amsterdam in the early 17th century.
Really?
Yeah, and it stayed about like that, maybe a bit fewer by 1800. But there also were gin shops where you could go get gin, or the same places that sold beer would sell gin. And there was a shift over time away from beer and toward gin.
Wow.
Again, and even more so around the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, governments charged tax on alcoholic beverages by volume. So the cost of a glass of gin was taxed the same as a glass of beer.
Oh, that's interesting.
So per unit alcohol, the gin was a much better buy.
That's really interesting. Wow.
By the middle of the 19th century, governments figured out that this was not such a good idea. And so they began to raise taxes on gin, on Jenever.
Wow. And you've touched on this a little bit, but what beverages were competing with Jenever, and did that change over time?
Yeah, very definitely. The big competition, because it's alcohol, was beer. And as Jenever consumption went up, brewing beer consumption went down.
Until that little tax policy piece.
Yep. Yep. So the the change was dramatic. Let's say, for every unit of beer drunk, there were whenever an extra unit of Jenever was sold, there was a drop of 80% in the amount of beer consumed of the same size. If people were drinking a liter more of Jenever, they drink 0.8 liters of beer less. So as you can imagine, it's because Jenever sales were going up, beer sales were going down. But they both suffered from other drinks which offered stimulation, tropical drinks like coffee, tea, cocoa. And they were really not, they were around by the 1670s, 1680s, but again, they came in as good for your health. So medicinal purposes, only sold in apothecary shops.
Cocoa,
yeah. Dutch chocolate makers developed a way to produce a less bitter drink sometime around 1700. So sales rose considerably. And they were also promoted as drinks that you might not get drunk if you had them, but you also might feel just as good on a cup of coffee, or you could fly high on 2 or 3 cups of coffee.
Wow.
So they competed as well. And then there were the old standards of wine and brandy, which were still around, which also Jenever had to overcome. But as you said, the tax policy at the end of the 18th century and then larger scale in the 19th century production meant that Jenever was really the popular alcoholic drink. There was a revival in brewing after around 1870. I picked that date because that's when the Amstel Brewery was found. Around then, the Amstel Brewery was founded, and Heineken was founded. So the quality of beer improved. So the two competed well, and still do in the 21st century.
Wow, that leads nicely into my very last question for you. Is it fair to say that Jenever is the national drink of the Netherlands?
It's illegal to call something Jenever outside of the Netherlands. So that means that and Belgium. I'm sorry, my apologies. I'm almost certain, I have not seen specific and recent statistics, that Belgians drink more Jenever per capita than do Dutchmen.
Wow.
But I could be wrong. Certainly consumption is considerable in Belgium, certainly in Belgium in general. But So in that sense, it is a national drink because nobody else can make it. And while it was popular overseas in the 17th and 18th centuries, that popularity is flagged over the years, so that there's less of it sold overseas. The drink that was considered to be a drink of the people was beer. And beer was I guess, the folksdrank, just like herring was a standard and bread were standards. Those were standards of the Dutch diet. So I'm not sure you can call Jenever the drink of the Netherlands.
It was a little bit of a trick question for an expert on beer history.
You're absolutely right.
And a fairly diplomatic answer. So thank you for that. So it depends on how you look at it, but it could be a fair statement in some context. So that's what I've gathered from what you said. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, it's been really lovely chatting with you today, Richard. I've learned so much, and I'm sure we've all learned a lot and really appreciated the knowledge that you've shared with us. So thank you so much for your time and for all of your sharing. It's been lovely to chat with you today, Richard.
Well, thank you. It's been lovely to chat with you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. And now we'll go live back to the Woods Distillery.